I'm Kathy Ferris. I was born in 1952. My parents were Denny and Alberta Fry.
Where were you born?
I was born in Lompoc, California. He was in the service, and my parents almost stayed down there from what I hear, but we moved back to Washington. And my folks bought a little house, and we lived there for 10 years in Auburn, Washington. And so that was my first defining moment. In fact, my little sister Linda was the one baby that was born that I remember. She was born in Renton, Washington, and we were all like close, under 2 years apart. And just bringing that baby home was just an amazing thing. And so we lived there for 10 years, and then we moved to what was my dream, is to live on a farm and to have animals and cattle and just space, and horses especially. I was a horse nut. And we lived there for 10 years, and I got to know my dad. My dad was in construction, and he was gone a lot. He was a superintendent in construction, and so he would be gone for some, weeks. And so when we moved there, it was nice because we had the cattle, and my dad was really into that too. And so I would work with him more than I would work with my mother. Because I don't know, some daughters and mothers really, maybe we're too much alike, I don't know. But it was a great childhood. We lived out where you could ride horses all day long and not run into anybody, although there were some creepy moments. People just appear in the woods. It's like, what are you doing out here? But so I went to school. Hated school. Junior high was like I don't know what happened to everybody. Maybe it was just all me. I don't know. But that's when I made this decision. I can't do this for 6 more years or 5 more years or whatever it is. It's 6 more years. So I quit my sophomore year and walked home, which was quite a ways. And when I walked down, I told my parents, I'm done with school. And they said, okay, because they had fought it so much that they just gave into it. And they made me take my GED and then go to beauty school at 16. And that was an experience, because I think a lot of people that were in beauty school were like me. We were misfits. What do we do with these people? These girls. We stick them in beauty school. Maybe that'll work. But it was fun and crazy, and yeah. And then my mom decided to go to beauty school with me, which probably wasn't a good idea, because I was a smoker. I smoked and was actually dealing some drugs in beauty school. And she caught me a couple of times, and so and then what do I say? What does one say? I started, I think, really going sideways. Is my uncle was the first one that introduced me to pot, and my mother introduced me to speed at the time. And I always said, raising my kids, more things are caught than taught, because people can say one thing and yet you see another thing in their lifestyle. And so and maybe my mom, I mean, she was a believer in Jesus, so was my dad, but just the ups and downs of their life. And mom wouldn't always tell the truth. She would bend the truth. Like, dad was always getting calls, and she would answer the phone, and then she'd tell my dad, go stand outside so I can say you're not here. Which to a kid is like, huh? Is that, it. And I've listened, I mean, I paid a lot of attention to, I think, looking back on people around me. I'd rather be in the kitchen listening to the adults than being outside playing with the kids, unless there was horses. So, anyway, yeah. And then there was the season where it was drugs, rock and roll, and I'll explain this. But during that time, it was like the late 60s or early 70s, that it was a crazy time. I mean, they think it's crazy now, but there was the Martin Luther King, our president, was shot and killed. His brother was shot and killed. There was riots because of the Vietnam War, and then we had the feminist movement, which all I heard is, if it feels good, do it, and men are stupid, and women are and it kind of like messed me up, Well, I started living like whatever felt good, did it. Oh, I forgot this part. I was molested. I gotta fill this in. I was molested by a 20-some-year-old cousin, and I was 12, and oh God, and I liked it. And so that hung with me, and especially with the influence of Women's Lib, I just did whatever I felt. And so there was a lot of men or boys or whatever. So I digress. Anyway, why did I even say that? Am I supposed to say stuff like that? Oh gosh. But and I literally, in every area of my life, whatever felt good, I did. Lying, stealing, cheating, I always thought, why does this bother you? If I mess around with your husband, why does that bother you? It's just, but my mindset was just completely whacked. And I eventually ended up facing 3 years at women's prison. And I remember sitting in jail, and I started thinking about everything, and I couldn't handle jail. It was bizarre. The reason I ended up facing 3 years at a women's penitentiary is because I had a brother-in-law that worked at the sale yard, and I had this brilliant idea about stealing cattle. Cattle price, I knew cattle. Cattle prices were way high, and so we did it. I brought the trucks in. When the cattle were sold and run through the gate, they loaded my trucks, not somebody else's truck, and away we went. And nothing really happened for a few years, and then one day somebody comes knocking, and somebody turns state evidence on me, which there was about 4 people involved besides myself, but I was the ringleader. So in some ways I rationalized the fact that, okay, I'm not gonna burn somebody else to save my butt, because even when I went to the attorney, that I had for a while, he said, "Oh yeah, we can get you out of this." And at that point in my life, I thought, I gotta stop this. Something's gotta stop. And so I went and actually went to the prosecuting attorney and kind of cut my own deal, and I told him the situation. And they give you these lawyers to stand up, if you can't afford a lawyer, they'll get you a lawyer. But this guy was more nervous than I was, standing before the judge, and I thought, well, this ain't gonna work. But the prosecuting attorney that I had talked to literally stood up for me and said, that I deserved probation. And cattle rustling, for all the other things I was doing in my life, was almost comical to some people, even to the justices and the police. Oh yeah, she's a cattle rustler. And it was like, that's still a hanging offense, And so I just saw, I go back to, I was raised as a Christian, even though, you see discrepancies in believers. And that's when I started asking the Lord, for help. Anyway, so I pleaded guilty, got 3 years probation, went on my way, and literally almost started doing the same thing all over again. It was just nuts. In fact, my sister, Linda, and back then baby stuff was really expensive because women's lib, nobody was having babies. In fact, you were called stupid if you were pregnant in a store. That happened to me. I'm like, what? Yeah, you're having a baby, you're wasting your life. Anyway, so when she was pregnant and she couldn't afford a crib, and so we went shoplifting, and we went to the Tacoma Mall, and we initially bought the mattress, but when they display it with the mattress, the crib, everything. And in our dumb minds, we're thinking, oh yeah, we can get this. Well, we only got the mattress. So we went downstairs, picked up the mattress, and then collected other things as we walked out of the store. But we would, occasionally go shoplifting. Anyway, one day, and she was with me, and she was very pregnant, and she was underage. She was like 17, I think. Can't remember how old she was, but she was pretty young. Maybe she was 16. And we got caught shoplifting, and they took her to Raymond Hall, and they took me to jail. And little did I know that once you break probation like that, you go directly to a women's penitentiary. And so I'm sitting in jail for about 3 days, and I finally, actually the first so many hours, I called my parents and said, hey, you got to get Linda out of there, it's my fault, blah, blah, blah. And then I spent a few weeks, and one of the first things I did is I said, can I get a Bible? So I started reading the Bible myself, which made me realize that not everything you hear at church is right. Esther, the story of Esther, that was a short book in the Bible, so I thought I'll read that. And we were told growing up that we couldn't wear makeup, we couldn't wear jewelry, we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that. And when I read the book of Esther, which they used as a representation of how we should live, Esther was being groomed to be the queen, to be presented to the king. And she did everything. She took all the beauty treatments. She wore all the clothes that she was, in fact, she had favor with the guy that was kind of helping her. And I'm like, well, if they lied about this, or they misconstrued this story. Where else have they lied? And so I just got into it. I just started reading it, and I found out that we're saved by grace, not by works. And the fact the Bible calls, the Bible calls that we're covered in. That's why Jesus died, is the blood of Jesus, and he paid for all of our sins. He wiped us clean. Anyway, so then I just figured, okay, well, God, I started reading because I figured if anybody could get me out of this situation, it had to be God. It's like I never turned my back on God. I always believed in him. And my probation officer really did not like me. He thought I was a spoiled little, and maybe I was, I don't know. So anyway, he eventually came, my name was called to get released. And I just, they get you up at the crack of dawn. You can't even sleep after that point. So they sit you out on these hard concrete things, and I had fallen asleep and my legs were asleep. And so when they called my name, I'm like staggering over to the door. And when I went home, and my probation officer had driven me home, and I remember feeling so humbled, but it was a good humble. Like God could do something with me after that. Like I would do anything, I almost wish I could get that feeling back of just being clean and fresh and new. And anyway, so after that, occasionally I would get pulled over for bench warrants. But my life got progressively better, and then I met my husband, who was a veterinarian, and he'd come out to my dad's farm, and
that's how you met him?
That's how I met him. But I quit dating because I was, you date, and somebody always gets hurt or mad, or it was frustrating to date. I didn't like it. And nobody's their real self generally when they're dating anyway. And so I just told the Lord, I said, you find me a husband. One of the reasons I wanted to get married, I know this sounds awful, is because I go on vacations with people, even when I paid the way. And they'd be homesick or pining over a boyfriend or doing this or doing that. And it was like, I don't like this. I want somebody I can take a vacation and also make love, and just have all the perks of it. And so I just made a deal with the Lord. I said, I'm not gonna date anymore. And I wore a wedding band, and so when he showed up, I didn't think, in fact, I was kind of ticked off that he was the wrong vet that came out. And then it took about 3 times. He kept having to come back for this one cow that had, eventually he figured out she had a broken leg, but we had another heifer in a corral, and she was crazy, and if she wasn't bred, Dad said, I want to butcher her. So I had him preg check her, but he had to catch her up, and I said, I'm gonna go get a rope. And by the time I got back, he had her all snubbed up. He didn't talk very much. He just did it, and that kind of like, I like that, and because I always wanted to marry a farmer, I thought, or and so I felt this attraction all of a sudden. So he told me I wanted to come down and get some medication and blah, blah, blah. And so he left, and I got in the car, and I said to the Lord, so what was that? You know, I haven't felt that in a while. In fact, I had gotten to the point in my life where I thought, it's not so bad being single. I can do this, And I'm driving down the road, and I made a deal. I said, if he's at the front desk, which veterinarians back then were never at the front desk, they were too busy. I mean, those guys work like machines. And I can talk to him, that I'll say, look, I'll pursue it. So, and he was at the front desk. And I asked him, I said, so what do you do for fun? First, I should go back to this. First, I called his house and said, is Mrs. Ferris there? No, Mrs. Ferris. Click.
Sneaky.
No, I had dated a guy that was, married, and it's like, this is after my renewal thing. So, and I drove by his house to check it out because I didn't want to date somebody living in apartments. Apartments back then were, and so, anyway, he didn't say a whole lot of anything, but he took my card, and then I didn't hear from him, and I have a tendency to get okay, this is stupid, I want to find out what's going on. So anyway, I called him up and I told him, how about if I come down and I have a bottle of wine and we can sit and talk? And he said, well, I'm on a farm, I'm doing emergencies tonight. And I said, are you doing an emergency right now? And so anyway, he wasn't. And I said, if you have one, I'll leave, So I went down to his house, and we, just started chit-chatting. And he eventually asked me out. But technically, I was the one pushing it. So, and yeah, it worked out. And just knowing that God was in this, that he was the one that really helped me in the long run after 48 years. Maybe we're 49. We're going to be 49 this year, which is the longest thing I've ever done. And so...
You have kids?
Yeah, I have 2 girls. I have 4 grandkids, and they're adulting, we call it. They're in their 20s. There's 3 boys and 1 girl, and 2 of them one's in the Air Force, one's in the Army, and one's an EMT, and one is still working on all what he's supposed to do. It's fun. So, yeah, that's, and God has been good.
Yeah.
I don't know why he gets such a bad rep. It could be us Christians, but he's good.
Yeah.
And he loves us.
What would you say is the most defining moment in your life?
Oh. Jail. In fact, when Dad was in hospice and we were talking, because my probation officer at one point said, we'll release her if you can take responsibility for her. And he said, I can't take responsibility for her. And I understood that. And, but it was, and so when he was dying, he apologized for that. I said, Dad, that was one of the best things. That was the pivotal point in my life. If I hadn't, I had heard a minister one time that say, until the pain gets so bad, you're not willing to change. And that was so bad for me, to be locked up with other women, with a toilet out in the middle of the room. I mean, it was kind of bizarre. and I can't go anywhere because my car was sometimes I just take a drive to Yakima just to chill out.
Yeah.
Yeah. 410. It's a great drive.
Yeah.
So that was, there's been a lot of defining moments,
Yeah.
but that was the one that made me, and it also made me realize who God is, that He's good, and He has a good plan for us. And it's the best life,
Yeah.
People say, being a Christian's so hard. I said, honey, sin is hard. And if you don't think it's hard, you haven't done it right. Because it's just, yeah.
So if you could tell your younger self something, anything, what would it be?
It would be trust the Lord and not think you know it all. Because we don't.
Yeah. And you're how old?
Huh?
You're how old?
I'm 73.
You look great.
Thank you.
You don't look 73.
I like to call myself a 1952 model.
Well, thank you for the stories.
Thank you.
They were great.
Because it's kind of a purging,